When my husband told me he was leaving, I thought he was joking. I was still in a wheelchair, still trying to remember what it felt like to move without pain. 6 months earlier, my son and I had survived a car accident that had taken away my ability to walk. The doctors said temporary, but every day without progress made temporary sound more like a sentence. He stood at the doorway that morning with his suitcase. I remember how the light hit the metal handle and blinded me for a second, as if the world was trying to spare me from seeing him go. He said he'd fallen in love with someone else. He said he needed to live again. I wanted to scream that I hadn't lived in months either, that every breath was work, but I just nodded. I didn't beg. Maybe I should have, but pride is sometimes all that's left when your body fails you. After he left, the silence became a living thing in the house. My son was 12 then, quiet and too mature for his age. He didn't ask questions. He just sat beside me and said, "We'll be okay, Mom." And I wanted to believe him. The first months were survival. We lived on the small monthly payment my husband sent, but it barely covered rent and food. There were days when we'd buy a burger and fries, split the burger in half for lunch, and save the fries for dinner. I told my son it was a game, that we were rationing like astronauts. He laughed, and that sound kept me alive. I couldn't afford therapy or rehabilitation. My wheelchair was secondhand. The right wheel squeaked like a sad violin. But I refused to cry in front of my son. At night, when he slept, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how long a person could live without hope. I started doing small things, knitting, embroidery, little paintings I made with trembling hands. My son would take them to the park and sell them to tourists. He always came back smiling, proud of every dollar. "We're a team," he'd say. And we were. But inside, I was drowning. One evening, when he'd gone to sleep, I opened an old laptop and wrote my story on a women's forum. I didn't ask for help. I just needed to talk to someone, anyone,
to tell them I existed.
A day later, a woman named Helen sent me a private message. She asked where I lived. I said Erie. She said she was from Cleveland, just a couple of hours away.
We talked for a week.
She was warm but firm, the kind of person who doesn't pity you, and somehow that was exactly what I needed. Then she wrote, "I'm in Erie today. I'd like to meet you." I almost said no. I wasn't ready to be seen. I didn't want anyone to witness what my life had become. But something about her messages, the quiet certainty, the way she didn't tiptoe around my pain, made me say yes. When Helen came, the first thing she did was walk straight to the window and pull the curtains wide open. Light flooded the room. I hadn't realized how long I'd been sitting in darkness, both inside and out. She turned to me and said, almost like a command, "You're going to learn QA testing. I'll teach you." It wasn't an offer. It was a declaration. And for the first time in months, I felt something flicker, not quite hope, but the faint memory of it. At first, I didn't believe her. QA testing? Computers? I could barely manage emails without feeling lost. But Helen didn't seem to notice my hesitation, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. 2 days later, she returned with a laptop. Not a fancy one, but new, clean, smelling faintly of cardboard and possibility. She set it on my table, plugged it in, and said, "We start now." I wanted to protest. I wanted to tell her I wasn't ready, that my hands still trembled when I tried to type for too long. But she didn't give me room to refuse. She pulled a chair next to me, rolled up her sleeves, and began explaining what QA meant, how every piece of software needed someone to test, to notice flaws, to ensure things worked before they reached others. She said, "You've been through enough to see what's broken. That's what makes you perfect for this." That line stayed with me. For weeks, she came almost every evening. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes with takeout for my son, who adored her after she taught him how to find free coding lessons online. Slowly, our home started feeling less like a cave and more like a classroom. The light stayed on longer. I began to stay awake not because I couldn't sleep, but because I wanted to learn more. At first, my brain resisted. It had grown too used to hopelessness. Every time something seemed complicated, that little voice whispered, "You can't do this." But Helen had her own way of silencing it. Whenever I said, "I don't think I can," she'd reply, "Then I'll think for you until you can." She pushed and I pushed back, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't trust myself. I had spent so long believing my value had ended with my legs. But slowly, change crept in. I learned how to write reports, how to spot bugs, how to read test cases. I learned to communicate with developers online, to feel capable again. I even learned to laugh, something I hadn't done since before the accident. My son watched it all. He'd sit beside me after school, helping me practice shortcuts, testing little apps with me. We grew into a rhythm, the two of us and Helen, who became more like family than a mentor. One evening, after finishing a complex project, Helen looked at me and said, "You're ready to work." I laughed nervously. Who would hire me? She smiled. I would. It turned out she had her own small company, a remote QA team that worked with startups. She said she needed someone reliable, someone with heart. And apparently that was me. The first paycheck came a month later. I remember holding it like a relic. My son hugged me so tight that the paper crumpled in my hand. That night, we ordered 2 burgers. We didn't split them. We even got fries and ice cream. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. I felt useful. I'd thought my story ended the day my husband left, but Helen had written me a new chapter. And somewhere deep down, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I could write a few more on my own. Work became my medicine. Every task, every project, every bug I found gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. My world was no longer limited to the walls of my apartment or the squeak of a wheelchair wheel. Now I had deadlines, meetings, messages, and the sweet exhaustion that came from doing something that mattered. My son thrived too. He was growing fast, taller than I'd realized. Sometimes I'd look at him and wonder when the little boy who sold my paintings on the street had turned into this quiet, determined teenager. He never complained about our struggles. Instead, he celebrated every tiny victory as if it were his own. When I got my first full client bonus, he brought home flowers, 2 daisies, and a rose wrapped in newspaper. "For the office," he said, pointing to the kitchen table where my laptop stood. That kitchen table became the heart of our life. Mornings began with coffee and school prep, afternoons with my testing projects, evenings with homework and laughter. The darkness that had once filled every corner of the room was gone. Helen still came by sometimes, with her calm presence, her notes, her unshakable belief in me. One day, after a team video call, she said, "You're doing more than you think. You're managing projects now, mentoring others. You're not just surviving, you're leading." Her words sat in me like warmth in winter. I hadn't realized how far I'd come. I was too busy climbing to notice the mountain below me. A year after she'd first walked into my home, I signed papers for a small house, ours. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. The realtor asked if I'd like to take a picture for memory, and I said yes. My son stood beside me, grinning, and I sat in my chair holding the keys. When I looked at that picture later, I noticed something new. I didn't look broken. I looked alive. That same week, Helen suggested rehabilitation again. "You've built your mind," she said. "Now, let's rebuild the rest." I hesitated. The fear of failure was still there. What if it didn't work? What if the pain returned? What if I couldn't do it? But Helen had taught me enough to recognize that fear doesn't disappear. It just loses power when you move anyway. The first sessions were agony. My legs shook under my weight. My arms ached from years of compensating. But I remembered every line of Helen's quiet firmness. Step by step. Even if you crawl, it counts. And so I crawled, figuratively and literally. Every inch of progress felt like reclaiming a stolen piece of myself. My son attended every session he could. He'd count out loud, "One more, Mom," until the therapist had to tell him to breathe. After 6 months, I took my first unassisted steps with a cane. I cried before I even realized I was crying. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. But it was me, standing again in a world I'd once thought I'd never walk through. When I showed Helen, she just smiled, that same calm, almost teasing smile, and said, "Told you you'd do it." I asked her once why she'd helped me. She shrugged. "Because someone once helped me." I wanted to know more, but she changed the subject, pretending to fuss over my posture. That was her way, never taking credit, never making it about herself. By the end of that year, I wasn't the woman my husband had left behind. I wasn't the woman sitting in the dark, whispering to the ceiling for mercy. I was a professional, a mother, a woman learning to walk again, literally and figuratively. And though Helen never said it, I could tell she was proud. I took my first real walk alone on a Sunday morning. The air smelled like rain, and the grass was still wet, but I didn't care. I walked, slowly, carefully, from our little gate to the end of the street, gripping my cane like a sword. My son trailed behind me with his phone out, recording every shaky step. When I turned around, the sun was just coming out from behind the clouds. The light hit my face, and I thought of that first day Helen had opened the curtains in my apartment, the day she dragged me back into the world. A year earlier, I'd been in darkness, barely surviving. Now I was walking toward the light.
Toward life.
Work was going well too. Helen's company had grown, and she often joked that I was her secret weapon. But what she didn't realize was that she had been mine. When her birthday came around, my son and I took the bus to Cleveland. I hadn't traveled since the accident, but I wanted to thank her in person. We showed up at her office with a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite. She laughed when she saw me walk in with my cane. "Look at you," she said, eyes bright. "You're unstoppable." I hugged her, something I'd wanted to do for so long but couldn't find the right moment for. And when I stepped back, I said quietly, "You saved my life." She shook her head. "No, you did that." But I pressed on. "Helen, you don't understand. I was gone.
Not just my legs, me.
You brought me back." For once, she didn't joke. She looked at me seriously, her voice soft but steady. "Then listen carefully," she said. "What you owe me isn't thanks. It's continuation. One day, you'll meet another woman who thinks she's at the end. You'll see that same look in her eyes that you once had. When that happens, you'll help her, not because you can, but because you must. That's the cycle of kindness. That's how you repay the debt." Her words settled deep inside me, as real as the ground under my feet. Months passed. Life continued. I worked, my son graduated middle school, and my walks became longer, my steps surer. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling for no reason, simply because I could move. Because I was living. Then, one afternoon, I was in an online QA group when a woman posted about losing her job, her confidence, and her sense of purpose. Her words were familiar, too familiar. I stared at her post for a long time, remembering my own message years ago. And then I wrote to her. I told her my name, where I started, and that I wanted to teach her QA testing, no charge. When she replied, surprised and hesitant, I smiled through tears and typed, "Don't worry. I'll teach you. That's what we do." And in that moment, I finally understood what Helen meant. The cycle had begun again.